Joseph de Maistre by Tage Lindbom. One of the ruling conceptions in Western intellectual life is the idea of progress or development. The created world in general, and man in particular, are declared to be in a state of uninterrupted change, leading to perfection on ever higher levels. In this historicist view, every earlier epoch must then appear as more or less imperfect, every human intellectual life in the past as more or less remote from the great synthesis of truth that the human spirit now believes itself to be on the way to realizing, whether dialectically or positivistically. The consequence is a constant process of repulsion. Yesterday's research results are marked by an imperfection that today's research reveals. The constant mutability of our existence requires constantly new questions, constantly new forms of adaptation, all of which lend to yesterday's existence a character of obsolescence, imperfection, unusability. Man receives an ever-increasing flood of facts, of new knowledge, and this is true not only in a purely scientific and technical sense. Even man's spiritual life, in a deeper sense, his meditative posture within existence, is also thought to be marked by an increased maturity. The man of age no longer believes, as the naive human children of former times did, in angels and trolls. Indeed, he no longer even believes in a heaven and a higher power up above. Modern theology becomes increasingly inclined to place the divine within the earthly as an immanent spirituality in existence. The idea of progress, however, is a fragile edifice of thought. It takes only an earthquake like that of 1755, which laid Lisbon in ashes and ruins, to fill the prophets of the Enlightenment with horror. And not even the extraordinary material, technical, and scientific development of the 19th century, with Ernst Haeckel's Die Welträtsel, published in 1899, as its ideological high point, can wholly dispel all fear and all doubt. Yet it is in the 20th century that the real trials arrive. Not only is the classical scientific picture of the world destroyed, above all through research in atomic physics, not only do the morphological sciences offer an increasingly complicated image of organic life on Earth, man also begins to doubt whether he really lives in the best of all worlds, and whether this world is in fact moving, above all under human guidance, toward perfection. 2 world wars have perhaps contributed more than anything else to this growing doubt. Many of the ideological fires of the previous century have been straw torches that quickly went out when they encountered grim reality. Rosa Luxemburg's alternative, socialism or barbarism, appears all too naive in an age of rising skepticism. What could be more natural in such a situation than to turn back to times gone by in the hope of finding there a prudence, a wisdom, that might show the way out of the blind alleys into which the prophets of progress have led mankind? But we are reluctant to admit our mistakes. We do not wish to acknowledge that for decades and centuries we have been traveling false roads. Must we be compelled to walk back? Is there no solution that points to a continued movement forward? In the existence of the profane Westerner, biological and mental movement, mutability is something essential. The notion of constant forward advance becomes an optical illusion. What is, in fact, a perpetual mutability, like a voyage down a river in which the eye constantly encounters new landscapes, this is gladly experienced as progress. Therefore, every standstill, every return to earlier experiences, values, states of consciousness, appears as decline, indeed as a threat to life itself. Life is movement. Stillness is death. With this doctrine, the Westerner clings ever more convulsively to life, and in this restless mutability, materially and mentally, he believes he finds the meaning of life. The great threat then becomes stillness, for with stillness there may come that which is feared more than anything else, melancholy, the experience of meaninglessness. It is here that we encounter the process of repulsion. The body of thought and the conceptions of value belonging to past phases are regarded as more or less outdated, unusable. To re-actualize this inheritance, then, becomes offensive, an impediment to the human freedom of movement that constant mutability demands. Everything that is regarded as obsolete may then, in the most favorable case, be treated with a certain condescending benevolence. But there are also thinkers who, in their acuteness and depth, expose the myth world of the secularized Westerner, expose the idea of progress and all that it represents. These are thinkers who attack and destroy the very foundations of this myth world. It is against these thinkers that censorship is mercilessly directed. It is before them that the iron curtains descend. They are, as far as possible, to be kept silent in the hope that they will be forgotten. Joseph de Maistre is one of them. Belonging to an old Savoyard noble family, born in Chambéry in 1753, he fled during the Revolution and entered Sardinian state service, serving in the years 1802 to 1817 as Sardinian ambassador in Russia. But it is neither the bitter fate of the émigré nor the scant gratitude accorded to his faithful service under the Sardinian king that determines his outlook. Joseph de Maistre forms his vision of life independently of personal circumstances. He emerges as a thinker in an age of profound upheavals. A revolution reduces an old order to ruins, and the Caesarism that is the revolution's logical consequence is itself destroyed without having given posterity any firm spiritual or material foundation. Joseph de Maistre dies in 1821, a couple of months before Napoleon, and what he lives to witness in his last years is that the gates are opened to what a younger compatriot of his, Alexis de Tocqueville, described as the Renaissance of the flesh, the new bourgeois commercial and industrial society. There are people who, with great care and short-sightedness, scrutinize the details of existence, give them their description, often in carefully executed classifications, and then communicate to their surroundings the results of their learned labors. But there are also people who climb up onto the mountain height in order from there to survey ever wider regions. They are people who remain settled up there in their macroscopic contemplations, and who do not even, like Nietzsche's Zarathustra, make occasional visits to the population in the valleys. De Maistre belongs among these men of the Alpine peaks. He does not undertake scientific analysis, he maps. Above microscopic movement and mutability, there exists an immutable order. Above the relative stands the absolute. Above the contingent stands the principial. Above time and space stands eternity. Above creation stands the Creator. The prophets of the French Revolution have proclaimed the individual as the highest thing in existence, the sovereign being who is to burst all chains in order, in this absolute freedom, to unite with his fellow men in a universal brotherhood. It is this atomism that de Maistre declares war upon, to the death. Never begin with the individual, he says in his St. Petersburg dialogues, not even with the virtuous individual, for it is virtue that is essential, not virtuous actions. If every good action were rewarded here below on earth, if every thief were to lose his hand at the very moment he committed the crime, then every moral order would be impossible. Divine omnipotence is the fixed point of departure in de Maistre's thought. Is man then a helpless, will-less object of this omnipotence? Nothing could be more mistaken. De Maistre is an irreconcilable opponent of Calvinism's doctrine of vocation and of Luther's assertion of the enslaved will. Man has a free will under the divine order. His actions are the actions of a free being under the hand of God. We men are free slaves, librement esclaves, as he expresses it in one of his principal works, Considération sur la France. We can therefore accept and obey this higher order, or we can deny and reject it. It is therein that our great freedom lies. We do not live under a blind determinism, but neither do we live in a condition of blind chance. The Creator has established an order, but we human beings have the possibility of denying and rejecting this order. Therefore, de Maistre sees as his chief task the reconciliation of the free human will and divine omnipotence. How is this reconciliation to be accomplished? In this question we have posed the problem of sovereignty. The universal rules over the particular. For de Maistre, this is a fundamental law of existence to which he often returns and from which he always proceeds. This means that there is a universality in the most varied forms of the created work, and this universality requires submission on the part of particulars, of parts. The universal is sovereign in relation to the particular. Thereby a basic rule of all sovereignty is established, and de Maistre is certainly not alone in maintaining it. His spiritual antipode, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the father of democracy, proclaims the same thing tirelessly in his principal political work, Du Contrat Social. For if this rule of sovereignty is not upheld, Whether we speak of de Maistre's kingdom of God or Rousseau's general will, the consequence is chaos. We stand, therefore, before a general human rule, whose deep and true meaning the men of our own time have so fundamentally misunderstood, a misunderstanding that in the end issues in denial. To uphold a sovereignty, an authority, has in the social debates of our own time become almost synonymous with fascism, with hostility to mankind, whereas in reality this rule of sovereignty is the precondition of an ordered human life on earth. It is a misunderstanding and a denial for which our own time pays a dear price, a growing moral confusion which, in its more extreme cases, issues in terrorism. That the highest sovereignty, the highest possessor of power, is our Creator, is for de Maistre self-evident. For the law-governed order that applies to all created things unites itself in the unity that is the divine source of all power. But how is this transcendent source of power to connect itself with the earthly? How are human beings to find the forms in which the exercise of power takes on its concrete earthly shape? Ought it not to be natural that de Maistre should advocate monarchy as the bearer of the highest authority on earth? No. He rejects this, and here he develops a line of thought infinitely remote from our own age's way of thinking. Earthly power, even moral power, can always be limited. Look at the constitutional monarchy in England, says de Maistre. It is said that sovereignty there is limited. This is false. It is not sovereignty that is limited, it is monarchy. But if the foremost bearer of sovereignty, the monarch, has his power restricted, might not this mean that the unconditional validity of the law is weakened? How can de Maistre, the herald of the rule of law and order on earth, actually approve a limitation of monarchical power? Man is imperfect, and this means that not everything can be foreseen. History contains only one cry, to make us aware that revolutions begun by wise men are always completed by madmen, says de Maistre, and he certainly has material for reflection very close at hand. Look at France, he says, a great and powerful nation which before our eyes has made the greatest effort known to history to attain freedom. And what has been attained? To shame and ridicule, the nation has placed a Corsican gendarme on the throne of the French king, and the people have been forced into subjection instead of obedience. Human imperfection, therefore, means that there are historical processes leading to results we could not foresee, that there arise regimes we must oppose, that there are holders of power whom we must refuse to obey. Human imperfection means that there is no law that must not allow an exception, no earthly possessor of power to whom we owe obedience in every situation. This is an extraordinarily bold thought, uttered by a passionate adherent of monarchical power. De Maistre proclaims, or rather revives, the right of resistance, so vividly disputed during the Middle Ages. Shall a citizen break the oath by which he is bound to his king? Yes, answers de Maistre. Human imperfection means that we may come into conflict with earthly holders of power, that a situation may arise in which earthly commands stand in contradiction to God's will, to the divine order. It is in this conflict that we must remember that we must obey God more than men. But is not the monarch sovereign? Here de Maistre makes an important distinction. Monarchy is something entirely different from sovereignty. Monarchy is an earthly institution subordinate to the sovereignty whose possessor is the higher power, the Creator. An earthly institution is imperfect. Its office-holding bearer may commit mistakes and perform unjust acts, and therefore it must, in certain respects and situations, be limited, checked in its exercise of power. Sovereignty, by contrast, is unlimited, absolute, infallible. Royal power is, by the grace of God. It is an earthly bearer of sovereignty, but the monarch's earthly imperfection means that there are situations in which the citizen's oath of loyalty must be broken. But what earthly form exists, what earthly manifestation of divine sovereignty are we to rely upon when we commit the tremendous act of breaking the oath of loyalty to the monarch? Does not such an act mean that earthly sovereign power can be broken down? This is the great problem, says de Maistre, and he formulates it thus in one of his principal works, Du Pape, published in 1819. How is one to limit the power of the earthly bearer of sovereignty without breaking it down? For resistance may lead to violence, violation, revolution, unless there exists a power that grants the exception which, in a situation of conflict, releases subjects from their oath of loyalty to the earthly monarch. Where is this dispensing power, this puissance dispensante? De Maistre's answer is the Pope. Every violation of the law is a mortal danger, But a dispensation means the opposite. It strengthens the law by the very fact that the dispensation constitutes an homage to the author of the law, the Creator himself. And the power on earth that is to be the representative of sovereignty is the papal see. I wish with all my heart, says de Maistre, that the interests of mankind in this matter were entrusted to the Pope. For the Pope speaks in God's name directly to the peoples of the earth. He thinks and acts under the guidance of the Holy Spirit, and therefore no one is so fitting a representative of divine sovereignty on earth. But there are also purely human reasons. Pontifical power is less subject than any other to political caprice. He, the Pope, is shepherd to his flock. He is celibate, which means that 95% of all the mistakes and passions that intervene disruptively in political life are excluded. The Pope differs from all holders of power also in the sense that he never, in earthly power struggles, seeks his own interest. We should not forget, de Maistre continues, that there is not a single dogma of the Church, not a single ecclesiastical custom, that does not have its roots deep down in human nature. Certainly there are differences between human beings and between peoples, but the Church at the same time expresses a universality. It is a common expression of that which unites the peoples of the earth. We encounter this not least in confession, an institution we find in antiquity, and which we have traced in non-Christian religions, in Peru, among the Brahmins, the Turks, the Tibetans, and the Japanese. And de Maistre places quite particular weight upon celibacy. Among all peoples, at all times, in all religions, there has always existed a common consciousness that chastity is something that lifts man out of the earthly and renders him pleasing to God. As a necessary consequence of this, the sacred functions are also bound up with this chastity. Celibacy is bound up with the holy. It gives its bearer a strength, an exalted unapproachability, which becomes evident, if not before, then when celibacy is broken. There are many holy and delicate situations in parish life which the priest is enabled rightly to handle precisely because he is chaste. The objection might naturally be made, however, that this papal power as the unshakable bearer of sovereignty on earth must weaken, indeed undermine, monarchy. No, says de Maistre, the reverse is the case. Even when the popes have turned against monarchs and condemned their actions, this has benefited monarchy. Every papal action against the earthly sovereign has always been to the advantage of sovereignty. The popes have disciplined monarchs, and thereby they have built up European monarchism. Difficulties exist to be overcome. It is difficulties that strengthen man. Through obedience, man compels himself to improve. He learns to overcome himself. And finally, by renouncing absolute power and bowing beneath the higher divine sovereignty, kings acquire, in the eyes of the peoples, the prestige that divine sovereignty bestows. The king becomes king by the grace of God, and the people express their gratitude by regarding their monarchs as infallible and inviolable. Our forefathers, de Maistre concludes, had this vague notion, though they were unable to form it into a clear theory, that earthly power must always have above it a higher spiritual power, a real sovereignty, which made it possible to control imperfect and erring earthly bearers of power, and in critical cases gave the right to revoke the subject's oath of loyalty. It is these vague notions that de Maistre now wishes to give conscious form, as a way out of the frightful destruction and confusion under the sign of 1789. No one can have been more aware than he of the weakness and decay of the French monarchy, and his ultramontane proclamation is, even if it is not stated explicitly, as much a sentence of judgment upon the decadent court life at Versailles as upon the excesses of the Revolution. In secular life, no real power can ever be established and sustained. The world is subject to the will and guidance of its heavenly Lord, and it is under this guidance that humanity, nolens volens, must bow. What de Maistre wishes to establish is a theocracy, an order in which heaven and earth meet. For no human order becomes lasting and beneficial for us creatures of earth unless the human free will and divine omnipotence are united and reconciled. That is de Maistre's chief message. We must, however, be aware that de Maistre here offers an image of the papacy, of papal power in the world, that does not accord with the experience yielded by political history. De Maistre attaches himself to what the high Middle Ages and the mighty princely figures of the papacy inspired by way of hopes for a Europe under theocratic rule. De Maistre's papal power is pure spirituality, not a temporal principality. It is in the midst of an age of historical upheavals that de Maistre lives, and it is in this age that he raises his voice. The Revolution of 1789 is the event overshadowing all others, and it compels him to leave his homeland. But it is precisely in these severe trials that his spiritual greatness reveals itself. He knows why revolution comes. He sees the deeper connections in this volcanic eruption of ideological madness. He knows that the Ancien Régime is not murdered innocence, an innocent sacrificial lamb in a cruel and unjust world. For that reason, Joseph de Maistre never becomes an émigré in the traditional sense. He never becomes that embittered being who has learned nothing and forgotten nothing. We are all gently bound by gentle bonds to the throne of the Most High, bonds that restrain us, but do not enslave us. It is with this thought that Joseph de Maistre opens his principal political work, Considérations sur la France, published in 1796. In the universal order of things, we act as free beings under the guidance of the divine hand. We are librement esclaves, free slaves. We act at one and the same time under the star of freedom and of necessity. We possess freedom of action without being able to overturn God's general plan. But human pride causes us readily to imagine that everything pertaining to the life of action stands wholly under our control, and when this active life does not function normally, man is inclined to call this disorder. Now we stand before a revolution, de Maistre continues, and constantly we hear men say, "I understand nothing." This inconceivable disorder in which crowned heads roll, in which the enemies of monarchy set themselves upon thrones, in which the greatest statesmen are mistaken, the noblest leaders are humiliated, in which everything succeeds for the wicked. What is happening? This revolutionary tidal wave, unleashed in 1789, sweeps away all resistance as though it were built of straw. It has rightly been said that the French Revolution leads men more than men lead the revolution. The scoundrels who appear to be revolutionary leaders are in reality only instruments. If they seek to master events, they fall inexorably. Robespierre, Collot, and Barrère never aimed at the terror. They were driven to it by circumstances over which they were not masters. They were invested with an immense despotic power, a power over which they themselves were certainly the most astonished. And when the measure was full, a gust of wind came and overthrew them. It is astonishing to witness, de Maistre thinks, how the revolutionary wave rolls onward, and at its head march men who in reality have no insight into what is taking place, but who possess all the more energy, all the more revolutionary fervor of belief. These are men who harbor no fear of the consequences produced by revolutionary excesses, who never hesitate and never look back, but constantly march forward. But does this not lead to an intolerable chaos? Is it not our duty to seek to arrest this mad eruption of human wickedness? No, de Maistre answers. We must not regard the French Revolution and the events in Europe that this revolution has unleashed as disorder, as lawlessness. The contrary is the case. Nothing reveals more clearly God's order and God's plan for the world than these events. The Revolution of 1789 has come because men deserve it. It is a punishment proceeding from a higher power, and this punishment is necessary if men are to come to their senses. For that reason it is wrong, through a counter-revolution and through wars of intervention, to restore the old order. The period of punishment must not be shortened. Men must be made bitterly to suffer under their revolutionary oppressors and their successors, and in that way, as de Maistre expresses it, to taste the bitter fruits. De Maistre goes a step further. Is it so certain, he asks, that all violent events, wars and destructions are as evil as we think? What we call civilization is a double-edged sword. It enervates and poisons, and in it, not least, the weeds of unbelief spring up. We might liken humanity to a tree that an invisible hand constantly chastens and prunes, and which through this very chastening regains freshness and strength. War and peace, prosperity and suffering, are necessary elements in the interplay of opposites that constitutes existence, and it is within the dialectical field of tension that the conditions of man are determined. That seems to be what de Maistre wishes to say. And above all stands a higher power, an invisible hand, that in the end governs everything. Just as de Maistre desires a theocratic order for earthly rule, so too in the course of historical events he sees a meaningfulness, in which man, made imperfect through the fall, must constantly be corrected, punished, and spoken to. Revolution is therefore not something that is wrong. It is by no means a human intervention that overturns God's plan. On the contrary, revolution is the punishment that we human beings must take upon ourselves in order to be purified and improved. Suffering exists in the world, and no social or medical striving toward pleasure and well-being, any more than hedonistic philosophical systems, can bring suffering to an end. With this, de Maistre also connects the idea of sacrifice. Human sinfulness and wretchedness accumulate upon the earth, and just as in the Oresteia, Helen is taken up to the gods in order to seek to arrest all injustices among men, so too, in our Christian world, we encounter the same sacrifice. The Son of Man dies for our sins. This is, says de Maistre, the universal and primordial dogma of the innocent who offers himself in expiation for the misdeeds of the guilty. It is in this reversibility, as de Maistre calls it, that sacrifice receives its true meaning. It is not evil that we offer in sacrifice for earthly misdeeds, but the pure and innocent. Only then does it become a real sacrifice. Through sacrifice, order is restored. For our existence is the order established by the Creator, and it is man who constantly disturbs this order. Through this disturbance, whose ultimate cause is human imperfection, suffering arises. If we did not suffer, we could never correct ourselves. Suffering is therefore as necessary in the spiritual sense as pain is necessary in the physical sense, so that we do not thrust our hand into the flame. In suffering, we become conscious of our imperfection, and thereby conscious that we must restore a disturbed equilibrium. The pain of illness is life's defensive struggle. It is in his St. Petersburg Dialogues, published in 1821, that de Maistre develops these thoughts more fully. Because there is a divine order, because we human beings are conscious of and subject to this order, we stand under a constant responsibility for our deeds. Existence is not univocal, and man constantly commits wrongful and harmful acts. In this interplay of opposites that constitutes existence, there is happiness and pleasure, but also misfortune and suffering. It is here that de Maistre introduces his merciless critique of the philosophy of welfare. It is a philosophy that leads man to become an animal, for if he obeys only his sensual impulses, his passions, if he descends into his own sensuality, then there he encounters only his animality, his egoism. De Maistre is fully conscious of the mortal danger threatening from empirical sensualism. This philosophical tendency has as its foremost representative the Englishman John Locke, and it is with unerring certainty that de Maistre directs one of his chief blows precisely against him. Locke preaches the pleasure principle. We strive after pleasure and flee what is disagreeable. Thereby man becomes a sensual mechanism. What is conceived as truly human becomes nothing other than volitional action determined by impulses of pleasure. The human then becomes the operative. But where then is man, his nature, his essence? The pleasure principle must not be the guiding star of human action. Of this de Maistre is conscious. Equally clear-sighted is he in his reckoning with faith in a constant civilizational advance under the guidance of science. The myth of civilization, the banal notion that man gradually raises himself from barbarism to science and civilization, is the most cherished of dreams. It is the mother of all errors. Nothing would have been more foreign to de Maistre than to abandon himself to a destructive anti-intellectualism. Few men in his time stood at so high a level of cultivation. Few possessed his learning. He left behind him large collections of extracts, the fruit of deep studies in widely differing fields. He possessed an immense knowledge, but he placed this knowledge wholly in the service of the Most High. Profane science consists in constantly disputing and denying. It is the paradise of pride, and therefore the man of science becomes the son of pride. With biting sharpness he scourges the myth of science. One thing I know, he says, it is not science that is to guide men. For these learned men, for these philosophers, there are no authorities against which they do not rise up, nothing higher that they do not hate. Thus we stand before a decisive question. When de Maistre rejects empirical sensualism, rejects mental experiences as true witnesses to existence, when he further rejects profane scientific inquiry as the royal road to human knowledge, when he proclaims a higher divine power sustaining an order to which we human beings are to submit and which we are to obey, upon what then is de Maistre's knowledge of all this grounded? He has himself answered the question. It runs like a red thread through all that he writes, but it is treated with special emphasis in the St. Petersburg Dialogues. It is one of the opinions that seems to me most important, he says, that the man who has arrived at a right opinion has been guided by an inner experience. He has learned what is true and what is false, and this without prior investigation, indeed often without even possessing any detailed knowledge of the matter. We human beings therefore bear within us a consciousness that is not connected with our mortal sense organs. We bear within us an immortal soul, and it is this fragment of the divine that reveals the higher reality, the absolute truth. This conscience intellectuelle, this intellective consciousness, as de Maistre calls it, is a secret instinct, an intuitive consciousness that gives us a true knowledge of eternal things. De Maistre brings forward esoteric wisdom in the midst of a world of revolutionary upheavals, rising rationalism and materialism. He grounds this wisdom in a deep participation in the spiritual, in a deeply rooted religious faith. But he also has a meditative insight that he has acquired through extensive study. It is not only the Greek church fathers whom he has studied, he follows the wisdom tradition backward. He is deeply familiar with Plato, and unlike most Western interpreters of Plato, he has genuinely understood the great philosopher. He has understood Plato in part because he has understood the wisdom tradition into which Plato was initiated. It is in Pythagoreanism and Platonism that he encounters the great mystery called the created order. It is here that he encounters the metacosmic power, the divine beyond being, the source of all that has come to be. Further, the macrocosmic, the created work, the world as a mighty symbol of the Almighty. And finally, the microcosm, man, the image of God, who bears the eternal kingdom of heaven within himself. In this wisdom tradition, says de Maistre, we encounter men who possess a knowledge that we ourselves do not possess. It is in this world that the Greek church fathers find a philosophical foundation, and this de Maistre has understood. I am Greek, he says. He has profound insight into the world of thought of the Cappadocian and Alexandrian fathers, and highest of all he places, and rightly so, origin. Man has a mortal psychic equipment, psyche, but he also has an immortal soul, that which appears as intellective consciousness, as intuitive knowledge, nous. This has, over the course of the centuries, been lost above all in the West, in the Roman Church, whose devoted servant de Maistre is. It is therefore all the more remarkable how he comes forward as a herald of this intellective knowledge, an attempt to revive the genuine gnosis, which unfortunately disappeared when the theological iron broom once swept away false Gnosticism along with it. De Maistre proclaims the absolute truth of an absolute divine reality, of which our world is a symbolic reflection. But in this divine reality, we also encounter the possessor of all power, and that is why earthly coexistence must stand under the guidance of this power. De Maistre's theocracy is no speculation in political science. It is the expression of the view of reality formed by this intellective insight into divine truth. The outflow of power that proceeds from the Creator becomes neither a blind determinism nor an equally blind chance. The world becomes an order ultimately guaranteed by the highest power. It is this order that is to be upheld, but it is this order against which men constantly transgress. This unceasing fall becomes a guilt, a consciousness of guilt, which man in turn seeks to repay through sacrifice. Sacrifice is a universal and eternal mystery that receives its explanation only in this way. How far does this sacrificial offering extend? Is it only a matter of tithes, of the gifts of the earth, of collections for the needy? No. De Maistre has the tremendous courage and the profound insight to move the boundaries forward. It also concerns human sacrifices. And what are human sacrifices? De Maistre answers, above all, war. If de Maistre may rightly be described as a forgotten thinker, there is one point at which the silence has occasionally been broken, and the Savoyard thinker has been represented as an inhuman herald of the most inhuman of all human things, war. He wallows in blood, it is said. He glorifies bloody slaughter. He sees in fratricide an homage to the Christian God. How does the matter stand in reality? Is de Maistre a bloody cynic, a beast in human form? It is in the 7th of the St. Petersburg Dialogues that the Count, his alter ego, takes up the subject, and he does so in a characteristic manner with this provocative formulation. There is nothing in the world that agrees so well as the religious and the military spirit. Then he lets the senator expound his view of war, this scourge of mankind. It is certainly no hymn of praise. It is merely one side of human nature that receives its merciless description. Earthly speaking, the soldier's deeds are something terrible, but this bloody craft also has a higher aspect, for the Lord of hosts shines with his presence over every page of Holy Scripture. War is a chapter in the general law book that governs the universe. For what does the human hand do other than constantly deal death blows? Man kills in order to procure food. He kills in order to procure clothing. He kills in order to adorn himself, to attack and to defend. He kills for amusement, and he kills in order to kill. But does this killing stop before man himself? Not at all. Men also destroy men. Man, who is moral and compassionate, born to love, who weeps over others as over himself, this same man takes pleasure in tears and in the end creates fictions in order to bring himself to tears. Do you not hear how the earth cries out for blood? The senator exclaims pathetically. And the earth does not cry in vain. War breaks out. Man is seized by a divine fury, fureur divine, which has nothing to do with hatred and wrath. He enters the battlefield without knowing what he wills and without knowing what calls forth this will. What then is this terrible riddle? For man performs with enthusiasm precisely that which he abhors. There is no possibility of giving this phenomenon a rational explanation, says de Maistre. War is divine, for it enters as a law-governed part into the divine order. We stand before an existential sacrificial order that finds expression in killing and in the giving of one's own life. Our earth, as though drenched in blood, becomes an immense altar on which all living things upon earth are offered up as an unending sacrifice. War is God's judgment of punishment. It is part of the mysticism that is the Creator's work. All human speculation must cease before this fantastic drama. The men of our own time, permeated by the pacifism that is a consequence of the secularized beings striving after sensual pleasures, turn away from these thoughts in horror. Yet war is a reality today no less than in the age of Napoleon and de Maistre. The ruthlessness of modern warfare, an expression of the ideological character of modern war, is something foreign to the warrior life of earlier times, and this ruthlessness expresses itself in two ways. First, through the doctrine of just wars. Second, through the conception that peace can be realized only when the opponent has been annihilated, above all annihilated in an ideological sense. Modern war therefore possesses a trait of ruthlessness unknown to the military conflicts of former times. But, it may be objected, de Maistre glorifies war, and thereby becomes the representative of everything scorned in our time: militarism, nationalism, imperialism, Machiavellianism. Is this really so? It is indeed true that de Maistre has been invoked by adherents of such outlooks, but thinkers can be misunderstood even by their friends. The ground of all misinterpretations of de Maistre, whatever the political home of the interpreters, is the inability to grasp the point of departure of his thought: objectivity. De Maistre has an esoteric, intellective consciousness of a higher reality, and thereby also of the earthly existential reality that flows from it. His outlook is therefore not the fruit of subjective, speculative, rational philosophical exertions, for subject and object are united in the intuitive experience of transcendent reality. Therefore, his outlook rests upon a firm objective foundation, objective in the sense that it is not marked by the contradictions and imperfections bound to created forms, to time and space. De Maistre has a cosmology, which he proclaims in accordance with what God's revelations, founders of religions, holy men, and sacred writings have borne witness to over the millennia. This collected sacred wisdom, sacra scientia, philosophically articulated in an unsurpassed way by Plato. It is an objective account of universal reality, of the world, and of man, that we encounter in de Maistre's writings. He refuses to abdicate before all the subjectivism of the earth, before all earthly interpretations and reinterpretations. He refuses to capitulate before the demands of scientific positivism and rationalism. It is this that so many of de Maistre's own followers have likewise failed to understand. But is de Maistre then to be understood as a featureless interpreter of a transcendent objectivity? Are there not in this man also personal, subjective thoughts and feelings? Yes, certainly. He lived intensely with the events of his own time, and even though he faithfully served his Sardinian king, he remained wholly alien to the nationalism that rose along with liberalization. As warmly as he felt patriotic solidarity, as deeply repelled as he was by Rousseau's empty cosmopolitanism and humanitarianism, so too was he hostile to nationalism's Machiavellian sacro egoismo. He could never forgive Napoleon for his immorality and for his wars, and to de Maistre the Prussian Frederick the Great appeared as one of humanity's great enemies, his monarchy an argument against providence. The rising militarism in Europe filled him with horror. Where will this lead? He asks himself. Peter the Great had armies of 30,000 men. Catherine II had 80,000, and now her grandson has 1,000,000 men under arms. Where is this hypertrophy to lead? There is something intoxicating in military strength, and now the remaining kings of Europe, too, have been infected and acquired a taste for military power. This batonocratie, as de Maistre calls it, is a real danger in the growing national egoism. There is only one thing, he adds, that I detest more than militarism: Jacobinism. It is certainly no worshipper of war who speaks here, and when de Maistre speaks of how the people stagger under the increased taxes brought about by a growing military establishment, it is as though a modern pacifist had taken the floor. But de Maistre is a European. He sees the common life of the traditional Christian world as the sole possibility for creating a condition in which man's free will can be reconciled with divine power. It is this possibility that Jacobinism, the excesses of the Revolution, and the Napoleonic Wars have destroyed. Nor are the treaties of the Congress of Vienna in 1815 able to restore equilibrium. For God is perfect, man is imperfect, and imperfection is the signature of earthly life, the source of all strife, of all suffering. And it is man who, in the blindness of his pride, will not see this, but constantly seeks to build his castles in the air and kindle his ideological fires, thereby imagining that by his own power he can abolish the interplay of opposites that constitutes existence. Men first heap up the clouds, says de Maistre, and then complain when the storms break loose. There is a note of relentlessness, of inexorability, in all of de Maistre's thought. Creation is an order with its unshakable laws. God is the immutable and eternal power that governs everything. Does not man, then, in all his frailty, become a helpless little speck of dust in this cosmic drama? Of what use, then, is his free will, when he sins constantly transgresses? Our picture of de Maistre would be incomplete if we did not also take up these questions. For him, the fall is the great drama that gives man his sinful nature. But man has been given a means whereby, in his daily life, filled to the brim with imperfections and transgressions, he may rise to a condition in which he finds help and consolation, in which he gains true human dignity. This takes place through prayer. In prayer, says de Maistre in his 8th dialogue, man attains amendment, and in prayer he is able to limit evil. It is through prayer that we can reject the blind philosophy that seeks to persuade us that evil consists only in unshakable natural laws. It is this slavery under a system of laws that prayer breaks. Thus, the image of de Maistre is completed. This great thinker, one of the greatest of the last century, bows in the end beneath a higher power. He knows that only as a child does man win the victory of eternal life. It is only in childlike, pious prayer that man attains his highest wisdom.